So good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, despite the busy pre-festive time. The topic of today's webinar is measuring citizens' trust in regulatory agencies, a systematic review and ways forward. We are very happy to welcome to our today's webinar our invited guest speaker, Libby Maman, who is a researcher at the Institute Barcelona of International Studies in Spain. Libby specializes in regulation, government, and public trust, all very important topics. Her work focuses on the democratic qualities of regulatory agencies such as transparency, accountability, participation, and inclusiveness, and how these shape public confidence in institutions. Libby also received the Bladin Davis Early Career Prize for her paper, The Democratic Qualities of Regulatory Agencies, and contributes to international projects on trust, governance, and democratic innovation. We will now proceed with Libby's presentation. You are welcome to use chat to post your questions, comments, or also raise your hand to speak up during the Q&A. Thank you very much for being with us here. Libby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ksenia, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. This paper has been published a year ago, and I've wrote it with my colleagues, Lauren Fahy and Stefan Grimmelikeisen and Moritz Kapler. And it was published in Regulation and Governance. And actually, this paper is part of the TIGRE project, which I heard that you've heard of in TRUEDEM. It's also a Horizon 2020 project. It ran between 2020 and 2023. So it's already over. And this paper actually was part of the first work package when we just started and we carried out a literature review, understanding what exists. And this is the first paper that was published. But since many other papers have been published from TIGRE, I'm sure some of you have encountered some of them. If you're interested in trust, then probably you've read one or two. The main question that the TIGRE project asked was under which conditions regulatory regimes are trusted, either by citizens or by stakeholders. And there were 9 universities that took part of the project. And just quick overview of the project, it focused on the triangle, the trust triangle in regulatory regimes, which has on one end the citizens, on the other the regulated organizations, the regulatees, which are often companies, and on the third, the regulatory agencies, which are distinct and a unique type of governance, but also other public actors that take part in regulation and in rulemaking and in enforcement, such as the politicians, the policymakers, administration, and courts. And the project studied these relationships both in the subnational level and the national level, and to an extent also in the European level. And as Ksenia mentioned, my research, my PhD was focused on democratic qualities of regulatory agencies. And also as part of TIGRE, we built a database of both the jure, so the legal obligations, and the de facto, the practical, the actual qualities of transparency, participation, accountability, and inclusiveness of regulatory agencies in Europe. Okay, so as I mentioned, this paper is let's say the introductory part of the project. And the background of the paper is that, first of all, regulatory agencies have increased. Since the 1980s till today, every country had an increase in the number of regulatory agencies it has established and created in different sectors. And they actually became a powerful state actor that governs markets. And another change that the scholarship has identified is that these agencies have become more and more concerned about citizens' trust, and as they became more socially embedded. So first they were more of an economic actor, but historically we've seen changes in them, and we see that they're more interested and involved in consultation practices and involving the public, caring about what the public has to say about them. And in addition, the scholarship shows that citizen trust is not only just something that regulatory agencies care about, but it's actually something that has an effect on the effectiveness of regulation. So this actually has shown that more trust in regulatory agencies leads to more compliance of citizens, of the regulatory regulated bodies, the companies. So more trust leads to more cooperation, more compliance. Also, another thing we found is that, and I was involved, you can see in this paper from 22, is that interestingly, more trust in regulatory agencies increases trust in the markets they regulate. So we carried out an experimental survey that showed that the more trust people have in the regulatory agencies, the more willing they are to trust the companies and to give them, in that case, it was their sensitive financial information. So all of this background brings us to the understanding that we need to study and understand this concept of citizen trust in regulatory agencies. But to do so, we need to have data. We need to have measures of that concept of citizen trust. Having this data will allow us to map the determinants, the effects, understand its dynamics, and to really develop this subfield. And another understanding we have, or let's say assumption, is that regulatory agencies are different than ministries. And hence, it cannot be assumed that just measuring the government as a whole would give us the same information we need. So in other words, if we want to measure trust in regulatory agencies, we have to ask about that particular type of trust and not use the trust in governance as a proxy for trust in regulatory agencies. So this brought us to understanding the research gap. So there was a review in 2017 in a book by Frederick Six and Koen Verhulst about trust and regulation that mapped the literature, did a literature review, and came to the conclusion that most studies until then were qualitative. So studies about trust and regulation were qualitative, and also that they focus most on trust of the stakeholders and of the regulatees, and there are barely any studies about citizen trust in regulatory agencies. And then in 2020, when we started working on this project, we asked what happened since, and maybe there are measures in international surveys that do measure trust in regulatory agencies. So this is what brought us to start this paper. So the broad question we started with is, how is citizen trust in regulatory agencies measured in current scholarship? And how adequate are these measures? How adequate are they in advancing our understanding of citizen trust? And we had three unique considerations for assessing citizen trust. So when we want to ask about adequacy and what is the unique characteristics of trust in regulatory agencies that we highlight, and we point into these three ideas of trust multidimensionality, trust T specificity, and context specificity. Trust multidimensionality is the understanding that actually trust as a concept can be understood in three different levels. Trust could be understood as the assessment of trustworthiness. To what extent a person assesses another actor, B, to be trustworthy. So those perceptions could be one aspect or are an aspect of trust, but it's not the only aspect, right? There are other dimensions. The others are the actual decision to trust. So the actual trust someone has is another dimension. And the third dimension, which is also different, are the actions that are a result of trust. So I mentioned the experiment that we did on trusting companies. We actually measured, we didn't ask them about, do they perceive the companies to be trustworthy? Or we didn't ask them about, do you trust the companies? So that's one or two. We actually asked, would you give them permission to access your bank account? So we saw that as a proxy, as an action that reflects the decision to trust. So these are the three dimensions. The second consideration is trust specificity. Here, we understand that there is no such thing, or it doesn't have a lot of meaning to just look at a generic citizen trust. What is that? Trust. There is no such thing of just trust. There is trust in a relation to a particular trustee, trust in some organization, in somebody, or in some actor, or in some person. You trust in relation to a trustee. And in that context, it is very important to distinguish between those targets of trust. And if we accept this consideration, then we understand that trust in the government is different than trust in the politicians, and it's also different than trust in regulatory agencies or a particular regulatory agency. And finally, context specificity is the understanding that trusting is also not only in regards to a particular target, but it's also regard to a particular behavior. So this is the conceptualization of truster A trusts the actor B to act in a particular way in a particular situation. This can be many times implicit, so often, as we will also see soon, not measured at all. But in the conceptual level, theoretical, and they were basing in our literature review and our theoretical framework, we of course mentioned the sources of these ideas. These aren't our ideas, but in the, say, the conceptual level, trust comes with an expectation for specific behavior. Okay, so I'll present the research questions of the paper, the specific ones. So we have three. The first one was, to what extent do the existing measures demonstrate the use of a systematic conceptualization of citizen trust in regulatory agencies? The second is, to what extent are these measures valid? And the third is, are these measures specifically to assess citizen trust in regulation? We used our methodology is built on two separate steps. The first step is a systematic literature review, where we collected and filtered out and then analyzed, studied different peer-reviewed published studies on trust in regulatory agencies and between 2017, which is when the last, as I mentioned, the book already published already a summary of the literature. We took it from there and continued until the year when we started writing this paper, 2021. And we also complemented it with expert consultation, asking different experts in the field of trust in regulatory context to provide additional articles in case we missed any. And the second step is a review of we identified 8 major international comparative studies. As you can see here in this list, the World Value Survey, Quality of Government, etc. So these are major studies that build on surveys and have a comparative aspect to them. So we wanted to see internationally what are the surveys that we should source for, and then what we did is for each of these studies, we downloaded the questionnaires of all the waves they ever had and searched for keywords. I will show that in a second, and looked for items that could measure trust in regulatory agencies. But we started with trust in general, and then we went over all the items on trust and tried to map them. So this was the methodology. So in regards to the systematic literature review, this is the inclusion-exclusion criteria for our papers. We focused only on articles in peer-reviewed English international academic journals, and we focused on trust in or by actors involved in regulatory regimes. So we started a bit broad. This included regulatory agencies, citizens, regulated actors, politicians, government in general, civil servants, government departments, and other stakeholders, the courts, the media. And this brought us to identify 5,482 articles, added by some additional ones that the experts sent us in, excluding the duplications And we had 4,311 articles, which we then screened titles and abstracts of all these. And based on the abstract and titles, we had 174 articles. And then those were, again, we went through another second round of revision. And based on the exclusion rules that I just showed, we remained with our final sample, or not sample, the final number of articles that we studied, 114. And then we wanted to analyze them, and we created this criteria of evaluation. This is to answer our research question. So how do we evaluate the adequacy of these 114 measures we found in the studies? So this is inspired by Adcock and Collier's. We looked at four aspects. We looked at validity in the sense of whether they are sensitive and valid. Do they actually represent what they are trying to measure? And here we focused a lot on the concept that they presented. We looked for, in each study, we looked for the definition of trust and the measure they included, and tested the measure with their own conceptualization of trust, their own definition. The second criteria was replicability. So this asks whether they used measures that can be replicable, or have they already been used before? Did they make up their own, a new measure, or is it an existing measure? Is it a comparable one? Has it been used in their study across countries and other sectors, or was it only in one particular context? And finally, we also looked at the transparency described in the papers. Can we understand how they built this measure? What was the wording of the questions, the scaling? Did they publish a code book, etc.? Here are our findings. So as I mentioned, we finally focused on 114 articles, which we defined relevant based on our inclusion criteria. So they seem to measure trust in regulatory context. From these 114 articles, only 38 focused on citizens' trust in regulatory agencies. And then looking into those 38, we see that among these studies, 17 were based on a survey as the data collection tool, compared to qualitative methods. So there were a lot of qualitative studies measuring citizen trust in other ways rather than surveys. And we saw that there are many different conceptualizations of trust. So the definitions were different, but the tools themselves were very different. It was barely, we couldn't find replicable tools, almost none at all. And we also saw that many articles were not transparent, especially in qualitative tools. So in terms of the transparency, we saw that was an issue. And we also saw that some geographical areas were excluded and were not included in these studies. So we can say that based on this literature review, certain regions are just excluded and not represented in the study of citizen trust in regulatory agencies. So this includes South and Central America, Middle East, and Africa. And also in terms of sectors, we saw that, I didn't mention them here, but we saw that some sectors were not studied at all compared to others. Also, I didn't mention TIGRE was interested in three sectors in particular: food safety, data protection, and financial sectors. But there are many other regulatory sectors that this question of citizen trust could be assessed in. So taking a deeper look into validity of as I mentioned, 76 studies and their measures did not focus on citizen trust. The 38 that did, out of the 38 that did focus on citizen trust, 18 weren't transparent, so we couldn't assess them. We couldn't assess them based on, we didn't understand what was either the wordings of the question or the definition. It was hard to analyze them. And we determined that 10 were invalid from those that we could analyze. 10 were invalid, so either they created a measure that wasn't aligned with their own definition. That happened a lot with just this unalignment often was because they added in the actual question dimensions that weren't in their definition, or excluded dimensions that were in their own definition. Yeah, and from those that were valid, this table shows only the valid measures. We divided them into the unidimensional and the multidimensional. So what does this mean? The unidimensional were studies that used a single question to assess trust. Those were typically, how much do you trust the agency, a particular agency, or how much do you trust information the agency provided? But in both cases, it was just one question. Multidimensional indices were composite measures, were studies that combine several items to assess citizen trust. Again, this is just a short demonstration of what they included, but for example, these two papers, they had several questions about competency, benevolence, integrity, and those together created a composite measure. We call that a multidimensional indice of trust. And among those, the 38 papers on citizen trust in regulatory agencies, we see also a diversity of conceptualization. So this is, what are they measuring? And we see that a lot are measuring the expectation that that organization, that the agency will act well in general, or will act competently, or will act benevolent. You can see here the different. Some were also no definition. There was just no definition at all in the paper, like I mentioned. Okay, now I move on to the second part of the study, which is the analysis of the items we collected from the 8 comparative surveys. So in total, we identified 246 different items to assess trust, not in regulatory agencies, to assess trust in public bodies. So this include the civil service or public administration in general. We found 25 items. General political systems, 20. The general, either in different ways, it could be called a group of organizations. For example, is do you trust the law and enforcement bodies? That would be an example of a group of organizations. So, and the government in general. And then we found 98 specific items. So these are asking about particular public organizations, 80 about specific public organizations, and 18 about specific political actors. So then we were trying to find, remember, items about regulatory agencies. So then we zoomed into these 80 items asking about specific public organizations. And you can see here on the table on the right, on this one, you can see that among these 80 items, we found only one item asking about inspectors. So that is one type of a regulatory body. And one about national media regulator, and the rest were about other specific public organizations. As you can see, 32 items on the police, on the court, the parliament, etc. And then also looking at the same 80s, what exactly are they asking? Is it a general question about trust? The unidimensional, how much do you trust the police? How much do you trust? Oh, sorry. So we saw those general 34 items that are general, and the rest were specific. So we had questions about 15 about perceived integrity, fairness, or impartiality, 1 item about benevolence, 6 about capacity or effectiveness, and 6 about perceived independence, 12 about corruption, 5 trust to do something specific, and 1, do you support that body? So so those were the results from the second part, the part where we looked at items in surveys. And bringing these two parts of the study together, we reached some conclusions. As you can see. So first is that when we look in international surveys, citizen trust in regulatory agencies is almost not there. So it wasn't a thing. Not generally. So we didn't see measures about generally how much do you trust regulatory bodies, but also barely specific. Only 2 specific regulatory bodies have been ever included in these major surveys. When we look into the systematic literature review and in the articles we studied from 17 till 22, we saw a paradox. We saw that while some papers use the same concept, as you saw, I showed you there were some papers grouped within the same conceptualization, the same way they perceive trust, they use different measures. So every researcher or research group developed their own tools. We barely saw replication or using others measuring tools. And this is an issue if we are aiming for replication or validation of tools, it is an issue. So, and then we also saw another issue which regards the validity, which is that despite the fact that conceptually most of the scholarship agrees that trust is a multi-dimensional concept, as I mentioned, it's not just the general decision to trust. It could be the perception of trustworthiness and the actions that depend or build on that. Actually, most of the studies still only use a unidimensional measure of trust. So there is a gap between the way that we conceptualize and understand trust and the way that actually trust is measured. In the context of regulatory agencies, although I assume this happens in other contexts, I would be happy to hear from you. And finally, the issue of transparency, as I mentioned, this is an issue that should worry us as researchers, and we do develop recommendations in the paper for journals and for academia in general to raise the standards on how measures are reported in papers so that other scholars like ourselves could review them and assess them. Of course, there are limitations for our paper. As I mentioned, we excluded non-peer-reviewed publications and we excluded papers that weren't in English. And this probably explains why our findings show that some regions of the world are excluded. We didn't find data on them. So probably our choices have some effect on these findings. Also, we have a limited time scope. This is very few years, and this is a limitation. And we do mention in the paper that we encourage and invite others to continuing checking the field and seeing if any changes and improvements are made in this as time goes by. And finally, the last slide is about the recommendations. So based on all of this, we do provide some recommendations in the paper. And I present them here. I would also be happy to discuss them. So the first recommendation is to, instead of every time that someone wants to study trust in regulatory agencies, just to make up their own measure, to rather move forward a standardized replicated measure. So there already are some measures that we mentioned in the paper that are focused, they were developed in the context of regulatory agencies. They are multidimensional, they are transparent, such as the CTGI measure. We recommend that scholars keep using the same measures. In general, to encourage more transparency in methodological reporting. Third, to expand our study of trust and moreover to test the validity of these measures in different contexts and in different cultural regions to make sure that the way we measure trust in certain contexts are replicable and can be translated to others. So this hasn't been tested yet. And finally, with the issue of the international comparative surveys, we suggest the idea to include an item on regulatory agencies. Now, we understand that it is impossible to measure trust in particular regulatory agencies. Not only there are so many of them, but also every country has their own bodies. So we discussed that, and we suggest that at least a general item on regulatory agencies as a group could be included in those surveys, and that as a category. Yeah, that's our final suggestion, and that's it. That's the paper, and happy to hear questions.
Thank you very much, Libby, for your presentation. It's a very interesting paper, and it was a pleasure to listen to you. We now have questions and answer sessions. Session part of the webinar. I remind you that you can either post your comments in chat or raise your hand and speak up. And we have the first question from our project director, Christian Herfer. Christian, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting talk, Libby. I was thinking the European Social Survey has always a competition for new models, 2 models per wave, and research teams can apply for a certain topic. So maybe this might be one research policy of your team to consider this to apply for a trust model specific to your topic and specific to your agencies. Because then, if you manage to get one of these 2 grants per wave, then you have a European-wide very good survey, and this would be one way forward to test it and to. But maybe it's too early. Maybe you have to develop first the instrument fully, and then later on to submitted to the ESS, for example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. We haven't considered that, so thank you for that suggestion. It does align with what we recommended. So someone needs to take the initiative and go ahead and apply. I do see one limitation, which is that these models are one time, right? So
Yeah.
So it is, you're right, we could do that to validate the tool. That could be interesting, but it won't solve the issue of the replicability or testing seeing changes across time. We did find in the ESS module, I think it was module 5. I don't remember. It was from 2005. That's what I remember. They had some questions on trust in it wasn't regulatory agency, it was police, and then willing to cooperate with the police. And it was very helpful for our studies we did in the context. But so it is a good idea, and I will consider and pass it on. But the main recommendation we had was to actually, I don't know how to push an item that would be included in the core institutions. So like the ESS and the WVS have the list of institutions they ask about trust for every wave, and to understand that, or to accept that regulatory agencies became a significant body and they should be included in that list. That was the idea.
Thank you. Yes, I think the WVS has at the moment wave 8 in the field, but for wave 9 there will be a competition for topics. So you can submit it, and if the questionnaire team of the World Survey agrees, then this item might be included. Because, as you said, we have already a very extensive list on trust items. So we have the list is growing every wave. So at the moment we have about I don't know 15 items. So it would fit nicely because we have a strong emphasis on trust in our current research anyway. So the beauty would be if you get accepted for wave 9, that you have already 10 trust questions asked for free, and then you put your own, then you can compare these different areas of trust in a systematic way and in a global perspective.
Yeah.
The ESS maybe is just for testing it, what is working, but maybe it's very complicated to get it, but just one option to consider. Of course, if you want to have a regular monitoring, the question is, what is the frequency? If you do it with a weather survey, if this is working, you can do it every 5 years and the EBS. If you want to do it every year, then we have to think if this uh, Academy of Administration, Inspire, and the Austrian Verwaltungsakademie and so on, if they're interested to have such a battery in their own measurements, I don't know much what they're doing, but they maybe have resources to do it between these academies of administration all over Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will look into this competition and hopefully apply for it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. So before I give a floor to Yali, I would like to squeeze in one question from myself. Uh, Libby, you mentioned that some regions were underrepresented in the coverage of the surveys. It's great that you included the World Valley survey. Some of us are obviously in this program, so we're happy that you found it useful. But likewise, there are also regional studies such as Afrobarometer and Latinobarometer, which theoretically should have a very good coverage in those regions. Was there any reason why the studies were not a part of analysis? They are not in English or other reasons?
Yes, it's an excellent question, and this really points into the main limitation of our methodology. So our methodological, we chose to look into international. So our inclusion criteria was to look into measures that state that they designed to compare the most countries. I don't remember the number, but we said I think minimum 8 countries at once, or I don't remember the number, but they were international in their sense, and that excluded regional surveys. So this, in one hand, could explain why we excluded them, but also our findings state that these regions are excluded. So this is a limitation, I agree. But I also might say that when it comes to these surveys, from what I did glance into some regional, didn't look at all of them, but I saw that most of them use the same type of questions when it comes to trust. So this is not part of our review, but just from reading and looking at other research, they most do the same thing. So meaning they don't focus on trust in regulatory agencies. It could be that we missed out on some, but it won't be. I don't expect to find that some survey in a particular region has focused on regulatory agencies and did that. So I assume that what we found in terms of the comparative surveys probably happens in the regional ones. Nonetheless, it should be tested and it should be studied. I agree.
Thank you very much, Libby. We have the next question from Yali. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Libby, for your presentation. Very much appreciate. So for me, I'm very interested because I was actually a financial reporter for 20 years. And then I worked for the financial sector where trust is everything. And and so now, I have my consultancy. I'm very much interested in trust, especially in the public sector and for public policy as well. My question for you is, I find it very interesting that it's citizen trust in regulatory agencies, but because it's citizen trust, and citizens are very broad. You have a lot of types. And currently, so for me, I used to live in France, and then I was 12 years in the US, and then now I'm in Canada. And so already across countries, it's very different. And you talked about standardization, but also even within countries, for instance, here in Canada, I'm talking about indigenous groups, for instance. Their vision is so different from the majority group. I was wondering, in your research, how do you factor that culture into your trust approach or concepts, or how do you approach that?
Yeah. it's a really interesting question. So I didn't look into cultural perceptions of trust. I didn't look into that. Um, but we did find, I don't know if this will answer your question, but it's a different angle to it. And a big issue with citizens' trust in regulatory agencies, which is, what do they even know that these agencies exist? And this is a challenge in assessing, in studying citizen trust in bodies that are less famous as the police, the courts, these big institutions. I assume that with particular groups in society, that problem is even bigger. But I haven't studied that. I didn't explore that. I think that is definitely important to study. I did do some studies in Israel about trust in particular regulatory agencies. And what I did find is that when it comes to the big ones, so central bank, everyone knows about the central bank, and also across groups. So we looked into different income levels, different ages, different education levels. That's what we did there. And the big ones are known. So trying to answer to your question, should be explored. But then maybe there should be some sort of so we should maybe need to lose some of the sensitivity in our measuring of regulatory agencies, instead of looking into particular bodies, that maybe looking at it more as a category, as I said, and or focusing on the more famous one, the bigger ones, asking citizens about bodies that most likely they did hear about, they read about in newspapers, they understand what they're doing. This is also an issue. Do people actually understand what these bodies are doing? So it is challenge. And I also want to add that in general, I don't think I highlighted this in the presentation, but there has to be some sort of trade-off. So for on one hand, we call for more sensitivity, right? We want more measures about specific regulatory agencies. We want more measures about different aspects of trust, right? Not just perception. We want more sensitivity, but we also ask for replicability and inclusion in comparative studies. And this is these two requirements, let's say, I understand that they are contradictory. So maybe an implication of this is that different strategies could be used for different types of studies. So maybe for these large comparative studies, we lose the sensitivity. We just ask about the category in general. This will give us a lot. If we had a measure about regulatory trust in regulatory agencies in WVS, for example, or European Value Survey, these studies have questions about trust in major companies, and it would be amazing to see the relationship between these two, because understand regulatory agencies are regulating major companies. Understanding that relationship between these two is, I think, is very interesting and hasn't been done. But on the other hand, maybe researchers that are focused on particular cultures could take a more could allow themselves to measure to use measures that are more sensitive about particular bodies, particular contexts, looking into particular groups, etc. So I think it depends on the research project. A different strategy should be used.
Thank you. And can I just ask you like kind of a yes or no things? And this is just related to the financial sector, but you probably, know there is this Edelman Trust Barometer that is very talked about. And I wanted to know, is that something that have you looked at it? Is it a barometer that you think is reliable based on your criteria?
Yeah. I love that you asked that. We really wanted to use that, but the issue of transparency was very, very big. So first of all, it's hard to access the data as researchers. Not every institution has access to those data. And I'm talking now about Edelman and also Gallup. These are two private bodies that do ask about trust, and they also ask about trust in companies compared to trust in government. So it's in the neighborhood. From what we saw, they don't ask about trust in regulatory agencies. Maybe the Gallup does in sometimes for some countries, but it's not the core questions. I didn't see that Edelman asks about trust in regulatory agencies. I did look into the published reports, so I couldn't find code books. I couldn't find information really about how they ask. So we didn't include them in our revision in our study. So that's my perception, is that they are very in the neighborhood of looking into the relationship between the market and the government. They ask about trust, right? But as researchers, it's hard to critically evaluate these tools. They don't follow the same transparency rules as World Value Survey, that we can really look at the code book and analyze, and it's a different type of tool. Unfortunately, it would be wonderful, especially because the asking about private company trust is very important when it comes to regulation, and most of the big academic, let's say, or academic level surveys also don't ask about that. The only ones we found was World Value Survey and European Value Survey are the only ones that have a question on trust in companies, and all the others have nothing about that. So we really wanted to be able to use those studies, but they're not as transparent and as we would wish them to be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Libby. We have our next question from Claudia.
Oh, thanks, Libby, for sharing your insights. I think my question now fits perfect in line, because I wanted to ask about the ECB, the central bank, and the national central banks of the countries. They are not primarily labeled as a regulatory agency, but you mentioned it. Like the Fed is a completely different model, but also comparable model. But they are responsible for monetary policy, price stability, so very important things for the whole European area. So would you say that it's you dealt with this like a regulatory agency or not? Because it's not clear by definition. Because ECB also has a lot of surveys, and they should be published, where they ask in how confident are you in the central national banks, whatever. So they are in the financial banking sector kind of a regulatory agency, but not per definitionem. So how did you deal with that?
Yeah. So in TIGRE, we defined we focused on, as I mentioned, on three sectors, and including the financial sector. And there we mapped the regulatory bodies in the financial sector, and we did include central banks as regulatory bodies, because not all of them, but many of them have dual role, and they also function as regulators of the banks themselves. So sometimes it's separate. So there is a supervision of a bank, which is a separate body, but sometimes it is a second role of the banks. But in many cases, and if it's separate, then we didn't study the central bank. We studied the supervision of the bank authority. Okay, I hope that answers your question.
So in Austria, it would be the financial market agency, which is separate, which controls everything else, so to say. So did you include them
I don't know about Austria, but I know that in other countries there is that is a third body. So in many cases, regulating banks is attached to the central bank, but regulating financial bodies, insurance, that is a third or a body. So it could be that in Austria, it's so the authority for regulating the financial sector also regulates the banks. I'm not sure, but from our study, mostly it's the central bank. That's why I mentioned it as a general regulatory agency. But you're also right. You said in the beginning that they're not usually seen as regulatory agencies. But they are. I mean, the literature of regulation, the regulation scholarship, definitely sees them as regulatory bodies. They're the first bodies, the ones that have the most independence compared to others. They started this, let's say, the trend of they started the wave of establishing independent bodies that are in charge. They have the authority to regulate a market. Later on, different sectors, while they received their own bodies, they didn't always get the same privilege like the central bank, not in terms of independence and powers and but they are like the original, the OGs of regulatory agencies.
Yeah, but the ECB is like not a generic independent regulatory agency, and the national banks are even lower. So, like compared to consumer or competition regulators. So that's why I was asking, because there's something in between.
Yeah,
So
yeah. You're right. No, you're right. And also, there is a complexity, like not all bodies are the same, which actually I think calls for even more sensitivity in the sense. So we cannot assume that we cannot ask about, we cannot assume that if you ask about regulatory agencies in general, people would even think about the same bodies when they think about that. There's a great variety within this category.
oh, thanks for your
Thank you for
answer.
the
Thank you.
question.
Thank you very much, Libby. And we're approaching the end, but we have one more question from Christian.
Yeah, very short information. There is a trust barometer which is conducted by the Edelman Trust Foundation in America, and they are very much business oriented. Maybe we have a look, they do it in 40 or 30 countries in the world. Maybe they have a question about your topic also, called Edelman Trust Barometer, Edelman, and they do it every year, I think. They're focusing on businesses, but I don't know if they're focusing on controlling of businesses or only how they flourish. But it's worth to have a look. Just a tip.
Thank you, Christian.
Mm.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for the discussion and the questions. I was really happy to be part of your webinar, and good luck with the project.
Thank you very much, Libby. It was a great pleasure having you today with us, and many thanks for everyone to attending. The session will be available online on our YouTube channel in case you would like to watch some parts of the presentation again. And I hope Libby doesn't mind. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out, and maybe there will be new projects or papers emerging from this webinar.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very
It was
much.
really nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye.